really excited to be here with everybody, joined by Simon Cohen. I have a mutual colleague with Simon, Craig Zelzer over at Georgetown, many of you may know, who's been telling me for years, you've got to meet Simon. He is doing so many great things. You all have so much to talk about. So this is the first time that Simon and I are talking on camera, of all places. But Simon is a media ethics maverick. In 2003, at the age of 24, he founded Global Tolerance, a leading international PR and communications agency that promotes communications with conscience. And he is a champion of personal relations, media values, and responsibility. And his team only work with people and organizations committed to positive social change. Simon has managed the media and PR for many of the most notable social figures in the world, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Gandhi's grandson, as well as representing Wallace and Gromit and the Jedi Knights. So looking forward to hearing about more of those. Simon is going to start by sharing some initial thoughts on this notion of communications and conscience, and then we're going to open it up for some question and answers. I have a bunch of questions for Simon, so looking forward to hearing his talk.
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you for having me. Manners first. A few years ago, I was in a meeting with a guy from the post office in the UK, and he said to me, Simon, last week my mum died. And on her deathbed, just before she died, she said to me, son, she probably didn't sound exactly like that, but bear with me. Son, there are 3 types of people in this world. There are adders, subtractors, and multipliers. Now the adders, when you're with them, your soul smiles a bit. You feel energized, added to. Just feel happier. Then there are subtractors. And like the adders, they can be your best friend, they can be a member of your family, a colleague, and whenever you're with them you feel somehow less, subtracted from, as though to add to their own energy they take something from you. And then there are multipliers. Now again, the multipliers might be, if you're lucky, you might be married to a multiplier, and I happen to be married to a multiplier, which is good. Or they might just be someone you meet once in your life, and they set off something disproportionate in you. The multiplier effect. So when I think about the media in relation to this and my consumption of the media, I can't help but feel sometimes when I consume the mainstream media, feeling less, feeling distressed. I'm a sensitive sod. I really am. I am. Yeah. I love love, and I don't like. I feel other people's pain, and when I read the media, when I read the newspapers, I just feel less subtracted from. So what I'm really interested in is how do we get to a media that multiplies, or at least a media that adds? And this is where I'd like to introduce the idea of communications with conscience. Now, a few years ago, I got one of those terrible phone calls that we hope that we never get, but I got one anyway, to tell me that my best friend, Gib, my best friend at university, that he'd suffered a brain hemorrhage, and he was in a hospice and he only had a couple of days left to live. So I decided to go and see him in the hospice, and that train journey was a really interesting spiritual experience, knowing that it was going to be the last time that I was going to see my best friend. And I went to see him, and his hair was all shaven, and he couldn't really speak, but he could communicate. He gave me that look that only Gib could give me, and it really communicated. In the sound of silence, there was something really special. And I told him I loved him, and that was the last time that I saw him. And why am I sharing this with you? Why? For a few reasons. One is that as far as communications with conscience is concerned, and when we talk about media ethics, like it's this big thing out there, for me, it's not just what we communicate, but the space that we communicate from that's really important. The emotional currency of our communications. So that's really important to me. But also, I'm subjective. You know, that experience with Gib has really fed my ideas about love, about friendship, about what it means to truly communicate. What is it that really communicates, that really passes through? So if I was in a newsroom and I was asked to cover a story about cancer or about love or about other things, it's really important that you know some of my personal context and personal baggage. And so part of the what Communications with Conscience is we wear our subjectivity as a badge of honor. And this is hugely important. Why is this important? Because even though I feel less when I read the media's feeling less as well. Circulations around the world in mainstream media have been dropping. You know, in the US, the average daily newspaper circulation has fallen by over 10% in the US in the last 6 months. They're flagging. So I'm feeling less, the media's feeling less. We're stuck in this cycle that is, for me, in my opinion, weakening the human condition. So there's a problem here, not just for me, but for the media. So this subjectivity, for me, is part of the solution for the media. Because one of the problems that I see in mainstream media activities is hiding behind the shroud of objectivity. We feel that what we're receiving is news, when what we're really receiving is opinion and commentary. And the line between news and editorial is so blurred that it is really influencing people's perceptions about some of our planet's most pressing problems.
True. Yeah.
Now, some would suggest, well, just be very clear about what's fact. I say no. I say we're all subjective. And rather than hide our own baggage, let's bring our baggage to the forefront. Let's open up, because when we do, my ability to discriminate, my ability to discern, my stories of Gib and loss and love and trials and tribulations make me distinctly me and who I am. As soon as I try and push that to the back under the veil of reporting as an objective journalist, I lose a trick. I lose the very thing that will actually build consumer loyalty. So there's a commercial reason behind subjectivity, as well as a social and a personal one as well. So there's subjectivity, there's communicating from the heart and leading with vulnerability, but there's also solutions. Solutions, not problems. One of the reasons why I think that the mainstream media is in the state that it is through this very, very old school thinking that good news doesn't sell. Bad news isn't selling. It's not selling. Okay. Bad news is not selling. Now, we may see a spike, a short-term spike with a sensationalist headline. Yeah. We'll see dead bodies on our news. We'll see naked women. We'll see other things that will try and piggyback on our greatest fears. You know, leverage on that bottom end of the level of the pyramid of needs, of the Maslow's pyramid of needs. But it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable at all. President Clinton recently said that we're now in the age of how. We know there are problems in the world, but what are the solutions? There's a premium on solutions right now. There's a premium. And what that means is more readers, listeners, viewers than the others. How do I know this? Well, there are plenty of examples out there, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss them. But I was in France a couple of years ago, and there's this new news agency called Reporters d'Espoir, Reporters of Hope, and they wrapped Le Monde, the major national newspaper in France, on Christmas Eve. And what Reporters of Hope do is they're like a newswire, like Associated Press or Press Association or AFP, but only positive news stories, only solutions, not problems. And they wrapped the whole paper, so a supplement of hope, wrapping around on Christmas Eve.
Ah, cool.
Their circulation went up 23% year on year.
Interesting. Okay.
Now I know it was Christmas, and I know that we're all in that kind of good thinking, but this is one of a whole catalogue of examples where there's not just a social yearning for positivity and hope, but there's actually a commercial, there's profitability in good news. And this is the best kept secret ever. There's profitability in good news. So we've got communicating from the heart, we've got subjectivity, solutions, and scrutiny. Malcolm X said that the media is the most powerful entity on earth. It has the power to make the guilty innocent and the innocent guilty. And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. That was in the 1960s. In Washington, D.C. in 2012, we've got no excuses at all for handing over the power of the minds of the masses over to the media. So our ability to join what I call a war on error, to actually be whistleblowers, to stand up, just like Superman as a journalist, stand up for the fight of truth and justice. That's why he became Clark Kent, by the way, in the beginning. So to actually stand up and become part of this war on error, to be whistleblowers, to stand up and to confront mistruths as we perceive them, is really important. And the final thought that I'd just like to offer is that this thing about the adder, subtractor and multiplier story, it's one thing to say, who are the media or who are other people to me? You know, for many years, my dad was a subtractor in my life. Not always, but a lot of the time, my dad was a subtractor. But it was only when I actually turned that on its head and said, well, who am I to him? Who am I to him? That transformed our whole relationship. And as I determined to be an adder or a multiplier to him. And it's very easy, very simple, because we just need to turn on the TV to play the blame game with the media and say, well, what are the media to me? They're subtractors to me. But what are we to them? What about our own media? What about our mouths? What about our mobile phones? Are we adding with every SMS? Are we adding or multiplying with every tweet, with every conversation? Are we responding and not reacting? And I believe that communications with conscience starts with the individual. I believe that through communicating with emotional currency, communicating solutions instead of problems, and communicating in a way that doesn't just move you on or move me on, but moves us all on, this is a way to try and begin to produce media that multiplies. So there are just a few opening thoughts that my perspective on communications with conscience.
Great. Well, I may kick things off here and pick up on where you left off. So much great food for thought here, thinking about subjectivity, emotional currency. You mentioned at the end there, though, accountability. How do we, as individuals and actors, become additive in this broader equation? What are some of the ways that we can hold some of these mainstream news media outlets accountable for, as you say, some of the sort of the bad news is selling model that they are currently responsible for proliferating at the moment?
Sure. Well, I think there are different levels and layers of accountability. Number one is to stand up and speak out. Now that can actually take many different forms. In the UK, we've got something called the Press Complaints Commission, but that's been pretty toothless, I think, in terms of its own ability to hold the media for account. And I think that what we're seeing, at least in the UK, is that accountability is not going to be through seemingly objective third-party organisation. It needs to come through my own personal decision-making and my personal capacity to raise my voice. So number one is to recognise, and I know that this is something that others say, but it's very important, that the media is an industry, and it's only supply, it's driven by market forces. So one of the ways to hold it accountable is to not consume it, because if fewer people are demanding it, then what will happen? Either they'll need to start supplying differently, or they go out of business. It really is as simple as that. What's happened with many of the mainstream media is it's not our fault, it's the fragmentation of the media, it's the internet, it's 150 channels on cable, it's all of these reasons. It's got nothing to do with me. But unless the media looks to itself, it's going to go out of business, the mainstream media. So standing up and speaking up, producing our own media is another way in which we hold it accountable as well, through citizen journalism, through our own tweets and blogs and SMSs as well as another way.
And then you mentioned earlier Reporters of Hope in France as an example of a group that is really trying to bring a positive ethic to the space. Are there other sources, mainstream or maybe a little bit less known, that you look to get your own news?
Well, in terms of getting my own news, I mean, there's an important point here, because it's also part of the problem. I need to keep on telling myself to look in other places. We've got, I use a lot of RSS feeds, and so I've got about 70 different news channels coming into me at any one time. But there's a problem with that. And the problem that I see with that is that it's so easy to find news sources that agree with you.
Yeah, and not challenge yourself
and
in that process.
Not challenge them. So this convergence within the media, I think, is really difficult. My mum reads the Daily Mail in the UK, which isn't quite the equivalent of Fox News over here, but it's not so far off. And I have arguments constantly with my mum about this. But it's really important for me to keep on have a convergence of divergence, if you like, to make sure that I'm consuming divergent thoughts and divergent news at the same time as finding news sources that I find to fit in with my worldview. But I blog a bit for the Huffington Post, and I'm enjoying seeing where they're going with their good news and inspiration sections, which they've recently launched. But yeah, I use about RSS feeds a hell of a lot. Great.
Are there questions from the audience that I can take here? Yes.
This is a great topic.
Can you wait?
Oh, sure. Simon, this is a great topic. It's just as relevant here as it would be anywhere else. And I wanted to ask you if you've seen the tabloids that we have now here in D.C., which seem to be mimicking the New York tabloids. We have the Examiner, which is a free paper, and we also have the Post Express. And the Examiner seems to be in the leading edge when it comes to those kinds of stories that you're talking, the negative news, taking things and making them sound worse than they really are. And I'll just leave you before I ask you a question. I'll give you an example. I saw an article where it was talking about how sex offenders in Maryland were migrating into D.C. because D.C. supposedly had more relaxed laws about how long they would report sex offenders. So I thought, well, what a story. I opened it up, and there's a picture of a guy that I was thinking about hiring.
Oh.
And there's this picture.
Boy.
Yeah, so, and I had to find out what it was that he was involved with, but of course it wasn't fair. Should they have interviewed him and gotten his point of view? Because often we don't hear the portrayal or a fair portrayal of the person who's being accused. And what are the laws in the UK versus those in the US? Do they think they're more liberal, more fair, or very different?
I think that the problem that you're referring to is quite pervasive. One of the most interesting projects that I've been involved in through Global Tolerance is the poll of the Muslim world from the Gallup organization, which is just around the corner, I think. And this is polling the world's billion Muslims over a 10-year period. And I think the Muslim community, probably more so than any other, has been a victim of this trend that you're seeing, us imposing a particular worldview or thought system about what Muslims believe, rather than actually handing over the microphone and saying, well, what do you really think about particular issues? And this is partly a result of ego on behalf of the journalist. A lot of the mainstream broadcast media has been about the journalist's ego and holding the microphone rather than handing it over, but also laziness and a lack of accountability. But I think that the problem that you're referring to is pretty pervasive. Did I?
Yeah, but it also led me to the question. You started off by saying that you don't believe that bad news is selling as much as it used to be. And I'd like to know how you come to that conclusion.
Sure.
If we see so many of these newspapers that seem to be going in that negative trend, so how did you come to that conclusion?
I come to the conclusion that bad news doesn't sell. Bad news doesn't sell sustainably, is what I want to say. Not that it doesn't sell, because sensational headlines will lead to short-term spikes in sales. But what that means is it doesn't lead to any kind of loyalty, because if you'll be sensational, then you're sensational, then you're sensational, why should I stick with you, right? Because there's no ethical, there's no moral framework or anything that guides that editorial stance. Where I get that conclusion from is just looking at newspaper circulation figures around the world. And there are others, and Bob from the International Communications Forum here will know that Ouse France which is another example from France, which is the largest circulating newspaper in the whole of France, and it's a regional newspaper. And its circulations have been steady or growing, while others have been falling by the wayside. Why? It's got strict ethical editorial guidelines. It's not a good, woolly, worthy newspaper that tells us that there's people skipping around fields with bunny rabbits and the whole world's a lovely place. It's a serious newspaper, but it doesn't feel the need to show corpses on the front pages. It's able to communicate and share stories without distressing, upholding the dignity of every human being and how it shares its stories.
That's great.
And there's a commercial demand for that.
That's great. I have another question for you, Simon, and then I'll open it back up to the audience. In our work at Tech Change, we talk a lot about how technology is a magnifier for human intent. You mentioned that one of the ways you get your news is by pulling together all these different RSS feeds. So, and we also talked a little bit about citizen journalism and the role of the individual in producing media content. In the past 10 years, that's just exploded.
Yeah.
How do you see that impacting your work, maybe in the projects you take on with Global Tolerance, the rise of social media, the advent of new technologies to produce media? How has that changed the landscape, in your opinion, and where do you see that moving in the years to come?
Well, I think it's huge. It's completely changed our work. In terms of the trends and where I see it going, I see that there's going to be a premium on social equity. And what I mean by that is the value both commercially, so the commodification of Twitter followers and Facebook friends. There's something very valuable about the trust that comes in friendship.
Sure.
And there's a real movement, I think, towards the thank you economy. Non-financial transactions on the stock market, I think, recently superseded the financial ones for the first time recently. So there's this currency coming through, social currency of our relationships. So more and more organizations are looking to leverage that. So to give you an example, we recently did the global PR for an app called Cheers. And Cheers, CHEE.RS. And it's like the like button for the world around you. So it's only positive. Only positive. So say I want to cheer Nick at Tech Change. Lovely guy. So I'll take my Cheers app out, I take a photo, and I will cheer Nick. And that will automatically go to my Twitter and Facebook and all my social media. And I'm spreading love and positivity. And what I do is I'll increase my cheerfluence. The number of people I can influence through being cheerful. And it's all very fun and great, but a few years down the line, if you're a business and you want to be able to target influential people through their positivity, suddenly Nick starts receiving coupons and other things as well. So leveraging the closeness of the relationships in Twitter and Facebook. So it really is shifting the landscape. But there's also a challenge with this. More and more organizations and NGOs that I come across, there's almost an addiction, a compulsion. How do we get 1,000 Facebook friends, or how do we get 10,000 Twitter followers? And it's all about these matrix, about how do we get more and more and more. And I think of the difference between knowledge versus wisdom. There are so many specialists coming out in terms of social media agencies, digital marketing agencies, buy 10,000 followers, do all of this. But what does it all mean? How's it all helpful? How's it actually moving the world forwards? So what I'm trying to do with Global Tolerance is actually buck the trend towards specialism. And this is a bit countercultural, because there's a whole trend towards the expert and the specialist. But I don't see too much value in that. I see that there being a place for that in the world. But how does Twitter and Facebook help us move on as a society, as a culture? How does it help us achieve what we wanted to achieve as social change makers? And that's where taking a back step and not getting so bogged down in matrix about Twitter followers and Facebook friends is really important, I think.
I think that's a great thought. We talk a lot at Tech Change about technology being 10% of a solution. At the end of the day, it's about the human relationships and how those human relationships are built upon trust, harmony, and other aspects. So interesting to hear you following that trend and forcing your clients to be really reflective about what their goals are in working with social media. Yes.
The first thing is that Islam has a very rich tradition of nonviolence. This is very little known, and it's not disseminated at all. There's a reference to some Muslims and some radicalism in Islam and so on. Of course, there is some radicalism perpetrated by some people who are born as Muslims. But nevertheless, there's a much richer tradition of nonviolence in Islam. And this is very little known. I mean, of course, when we were children, I attended an American school when I was a child, and that was the place where I heard the name of Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and Emerson, and much later Martin Luther King, and so on. And they're of course presented as preachers of nonviolence. Of course, it's absolutely true, but much earlier than that, and centuries and earlier, Yunus Emre, for instance, who comes from the very bosom of Anatolia towards the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century. And some of his poetry is like much better actually than the United Nations Charter. Rumi, of course, I mean, I think this gathering is not very familiar with that name. And not only that, I mean, bring it to closer to us here. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, for instance, among the Pathans, if you remember him, he was called the frontier Gandhi because he was in the Afghani and Indian frontier. I don't know whether you remember him. He was a very robust fellow and so on and so forth. But he was a very peaceful man, and that was his nickname, the frontier Gandhi and so on. And even among the Chechens, for instance, there are people like that, because there is really a very rich tradition of Islam, and I think that perhaps you should do something about that. I'm just, I'll be going back to my country in a few days, and it's up to you to propagate it here. I mean, because it's the truth. And you also mentioned that you get certain opinions from the media rather than knowledge and, you know, objective information. Well, that's very true, and this is also related to the first point that I'm trying to make. For instance, in Darfur, the clash there has been presented as if it is something between the northern Muslim Arabs on the one hand and the Christian or atheistic Afro people, colored people in the south. No, it's not this case. It's something else. No. And it's presented as if it is one of the greatest genocides in history. No. I can give you some other examples in which many people were killed around right, and there is no mention of that in the media at all. And the Darfur case, of course, there's been some bad things have occurred there, and there's no doubt about that, and I'm not denying this, but it's out of proportion. Mm-hmm. And we have to watch against this. I mean, it's very incorrect to turn everything into a clash between Islam and... I mean, of course, I'm a Sunni Muslim born. I'm not a practicing Muslim, we have to be just and fair.
Simon, did you want to respond to that?
Sure.
Maybe?
Well, I mean, there's one thing that I just wanted to extract out of that is again, another challenge with the mainstream media is that it seems to avoid complexity. And I think Rumi said, between notions of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field, I'll meet you there. And that's where my vision for communications with conscience goes. I think that we're at a state with citizen journalism, with an astute public, astute discerning media, a discerning public, that we actually want complexity, that we know that the world isn't polarized, that it's not all black and white, that we do some work with Christian-Muslim conflict in Nigeria, and that's been religious conflict. You dig beneath the surface, it's a lot of tribal things, there's a lot of political nuances there, and I think that in order to move forwards, we need to come out of this binary, polarizing, adversarial dynamic that the mainstream media seems to embrace, when the public's really not embracing it so much. I think there's a real demand and yearning for complexity, because life's not black and white.
Well, not only complexity, but how to get all the information that's necessary to judge a case. We don't get it. We get only one kind of opinion. That's all. Isn't that true? That's a question to you. Isn't it true?
Well, I think that we've got.
Is the media objective?
I think no, absolutely not.
Well,
no.
Under what conditions can it be?
They're as objective as you and I are. So.
Under what conditions? What should we do?
If I'm hearing you, I think trying to
informed all the time.
Trying to advocate for that subjectivity in journalism and be open and transparent about that is really.
I mean, there's an initiative by Tim Berners-Lee, who was the founder of the internet, as you know, with the Media Standards Trust initiative called the Transparency Initiative. And one of the things that they do is they use metadata, so meta tagging, so that you can look into any article and see where that article was first published, if and how it's been changed, any trade unions that journalist is a member of, the ethical standards from it as well. And I think that it's really moving in the right direction, because it's saying this is subjective, it's got a story, and based on the subjectivity, you as the reader can actually discern whether or not this is something that you want to take into your heart or you want to get different opinions for. So this transparency of subjectivity is, for me, a movement in the right direction.
I love that thought. Other questions from folks in the audience? Yes.
My name is Jenna with the Rumi Forum, and so kind of going off of what the professor had said, talking about a couple incidents that have happened recently, horrific incidents. One in Norway last summer, and now just recently in France. And I can see how, well, we know there's been some work done on this, a study by the Center for American Progress, Fear Inc., and this has been done, it's been looked at that the media, the influence on the man in Norway who committed those crimes, so he's been in contact with some of these individuals that are in the media over here and had exchanges, and he quoted them in his dossier. And then so there's that. So there's a reaction from information giving. There's a direct connection between the information that the media is putting out there and these folks that are perpetrating these horrific acts. And a few days ago, what happened in France, and I'm thinking about this man who probably saw some images.
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that while there may be a relationship, it's not necessarily a causal relationship, and that there's a whole spectrum of reasons and things that lead up to such tragedies. I think the question of responsibility stems from the perceived role of the media, and I think that particularly the changes that I've seen post 9/11, there's a marked need for the media to step back from the shadows of a message about reflecting communities that we serve and being passive and reflecting what's already out there, to being on the front foot and taking a leadership role and recognizing the power, as Malcolm X said in the 60s, imagine the power now of the media to control the minds of the masses, and the responsibility. Another famous journalist, Spider-Man, he said, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, there you are. So he was a great photojournalist, and there's a great responsibility that comes with that power. What does that look like? And I think that some of the good work that the International Communications Forum does is, who we've worked with over a number of years, is look at the personal conscience level of the individual journalists. And for me, that kind of Gandhian approach of being the media that we wish to see in the world is really where it's going to start. Ethical frameworks and guidelines are all helpful, but it's really going to come down to the personal conscience-to-conscience conversations that we have with journalists and media professionals that will make the difference.
Great. You got a question here.
You mentioned what the International Communications Forum is doing in Britain with journalism schools.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty exciting to me that that these schools have been opened up to.
Yeah. Yep. So one of the things that the ICF is doing is training schools of journalism in the UK about ethical practices and ethical behaviour. I think it's very important, but I think that we need to move beyond the idea of just journalism to advertising. As well, and public relations, and syndicated news as well. 50% of at least 50% of all news is decided outside of the initial newsrooms. It's syndicated.
I see.
The power and influence of advertising as well is largely unchecked as well. So I think that the work of organisations like the ICF, working with the next generation, if you like, of journalists, of communicators, is essential. I sat in a debate where, I don't know if anyone's heard of Max Clifford, who's a famous publicist in the UK, but he openly argued that public relations people don't have the duty to tell the truth, and would, and this is in front of 150 PR starry-eyed graduates who, at the end of the debate, because Max Clifford was so persuasive, said, "Yeah, we don't have the duty to tell the truth." Great. So I think that the work of working with young people to instill this sense of conscience, this sense of responsibility, but also this sense of power, as well as responsibility, is essential work.
I wanted to pick up on something you said. You mentioned, we've talked a lot about media today, but not as much about advertisers. And in this global modernized era, these things really do merge together, with advertisers driving a lot of the decision making that happens in terms of media outlets. We had earlier this month Rush Limbaugh make a very offensive statement on his radio show and then recant it. And the focus and the advocacy shifted to the advertisers, and they were then sort of put on the spot. Do they continue to support what is the most listened to radio show in the country, or do they lead with their conscience and leave the show? To what extent do we hold these advertisers accountable? Is this a movement you see in the UK with the outlets there? And how does it differ being an advertiser versus being an outlet? Maybe more about that relationship.
Sure. Well, I'm not a fan of advertising at all. I mean, my background was in advertising. That's probably part of the reason. I don't believe in advertising because I don't believe it's credible. And I don't believe it's credible because I'm going to tell you how great Global Tolerance is, okay? Global Tolerance is the best communications agency in the world. You would be crazy not to, and if you buy one month's campaign now, get another month free. Well, I'm bound to say all of that, aren't I? Because there's no credibility about it. Nick from Tech Change, we've just met. If you're saying that Global Tolerance is great, well then that's actually got some credibility, because I'm not paying you a few bucks under the table. It's that kind of credible third-party endorsement. And this is the power of journalism and media and rigorous trust versus first-party advertising. Unfortunately, again, these lines are blurred, and actually we're looking at adverts, and then we only see at the bottom right-hand corner or something, it says advertisement feature or something. Is blurring the lines about when we're being advertised to and when we're not. So it's a bit rich in a way that we're talking about advertisers' consciences, whether they ought to endorse something that's happened in the editorial, when really, let's talk about the advertisers' conscience themselves, of actually leveraging people's fears, their hopes, Coca-Cola, open happiness. Do me a favor, open happiness. So where's the conscience there?
Yeah.
You know, perpetuating this unreachable cycle of fear and hope. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but I'm not a big fan of advertising.
Great to hear these thoughts. No, certainly. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question.
Well, yeah. Let's go first. Somebody hasn't asked yet, and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, I'm John Boyer from oneblue.org, and I really appreciate your thoughts that you've expressed today, especially about speaking from the heart and having grassroots people, local people do that. I've worked on these issues for about 30 or 40 years. I was involved with the National News Council here. I used to be a professor of journalism, so teaching about ethics to journalism students is a hard thing to do. I mean, we cover it as an academic subject, but when the students get in the newsroom, often the pressures are so great. There's a culture there, and it's mainly driven around commercialism or commercially driven values. I make a big distinction between commercially driven media and non-commercially driven media. To me, my hero is really John Reith, the first director of the BBC, because he saw this very clearly, that the media should be to inform, educate, and entertain in that order, and even in the entertainment should be for information and education. Whereas here, it's mostly commercially driven, and whatever gets the ratings, that's deemed success and so on. I wanted to throw one idea out that I'm working on that fits very much with what you said. We're in an election cycle now, and we're about to be bombarded with political ads. And in light of the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, there's now more money. Everybody knows this. There's just a tsunami of cash, a lot of it coming from people we have no idea who they are, is flowing into these campaigns. Well, it's not very well known, but on public television, Bill Moyers did an interview with an expert, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who pointed out that local television stations are not obligated to run third-party ads. In other words, ads that are funded by super PACs. And citizens could be going to these stations or calling up the managers and asking them not to run ads that are false or misleading. And her organization at the University of Pennsylvania, there's something called FLACcheck.org. They started factcheck.org, now they have FLACcheck.org, which actually very skillfully takes these ads and then stops them and shows you this is false or this is misleading. But there's no follow-up. You know, it's worth looking at because they catch out the false and misleading aspects of these ads. I think what's missing is a citizen component where little groups of citizens go to the local stations and speak face-to-face with the television manager or the news director and just remind them, number one, they have a public responsibility. They're operating in the public interest. This is a public trusteeship that's on the books. They have an obligation. Number two, to ask them, do they check these ads for veracity, right? Number three, to ask them, how much money are you making from these ads? Because that also is something that's supposed to be in the public record. Unfortunately, not enough of this is happening on the local level. And in the process of doing that, I think you get people who care about these things acting, doing something, asking a simple question, just being there face to face. I think that is the component that's missing, is the citizen action part. And I think it ties in very much to what you were saying about coming from the heart, having a conscience, wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right, and having a citizen component's really important. But there's also, it would be very nice if we said to journalists or we said to politicians or presidential candidates, take a different approach because it's the right thing to do. It would be very nice if they said, oh, okay, it's the right thing to do, cool. All right. But we know that there are commercial and political motivations running through this. So our job, as I see it, our challenge is to show that it's both profitable and politically effective to take a non-adversarial, solutions-driven, conscience-driven approach to communications. In the midst of a very heated adversarial political debate, President Obama won his campaign on 3 words, yes, we can. While others, so it was affirmative, positive, and he didn't take an adversarial approach. One of the reasons why I feel, just from a UK standpoint, why I feel that he actually won over Senator Clinton, actually, was that I felt, well, I didn't actually really know anything about Senator Clinton. I felt that there was always something there. I don't feel that anymore, but there was a bit of a barrier to that kind of empathy and compassion.
Sure.
But I really felt that I thought President Obama, I could have a cup of tea with him and fish and chips. You know, I felt I knew something of him. And this is this kind of personal relation. So this communications with conscience thing isn't a soft, woolly, worthy thing. It's politically, it's commercially effective.
I see. That's a great thought. We have time for how many more? Maybe one more? One more question? Yeah.
Okay, along the lines of what you were just saying about advertising, I'm glad you brought up the point that you were in the advertising industry,
Yeah.
so your attitude is different. We're using the free media, Facebook, YouTube, etc. There must be an agenda that's hidden. It's much more skillfully hidden than the days of AOL, where every few minutes you'd have a pop-up ad, right? It was obviously overtly selling you something, whereas now Google is much more subtly selling you something.
Yeah.
And do you feel that you could possibly be swept under, not realizing that you are part of a machinery that you ultimately don't agree with?
Absolutely. I recently got married, and my wife, Kate, is convinced that every time she goes to Facebook, on her Facebook feed, there are pictures of friends with babies. There just seems to be babies everywhere, and she is convinced. She's like, I haven't seen this person in 15 years, in 20 years. Why are there just babies everywhere? And she's convinced that Facebook is trying to get her to multiply, and there's part of this. Now, whether or not that is complete rubbish or not is not so important as being discerning and asking the questions. I think as long as we remain inquisitive, we remain concerned as responsible citizens, then we're going along this route to communications with conscience.
Yeah, it comes up a lot in our classes, this notion of mindfulness. It's like very hard to live in 2012 and not be conscious or thinking about one's digital identity. And we're no longer in a position where we can sit back and let the interwebs determine it for us. If we really care about how we're portrayed to the world, we've got to be active. We've got to be rigorous in maintaining and ensuring that that digital identity is an identity we're comfortable with, we're vigilant about, and I think it does get into how does one be a smart consumer of media and understand the ways that these advertisers really are working in extremely subtle avenues to try and connect us to new products and ideas.
So if I'm sitting here next year with a baby in my hand, you'll know why.
Okay, so I think we're wrapping up, but I want to just thank again Simon for taking the time to talk with us. Such an exciting topic, and it sounds like you're doing truly fantastic work. So maybe just a round of applause for Simon and his efforts.